So in October 2014, this young woman on the screen behind me, Belle Gibson, was riding the crest of a wave. She was the creator of a best-selling app, The Whole Food Pantry, had a hugely popular accompanying cookbook, and was about to have her app featured on the newly launched Apple Watch, which was due to be launched in 2015. Now, central to Belle's success was the powerful way in which she shared her difficult journey. Belle had a malignant brain tumour, which she was self-treating through, in her words, the power of diet, exercise, fruits and vegetables. She was sharing her story on her blog and on her Instagram, Healing Belle, and she was sharing her journey and generating large amounts of money, both for herself and for cancer charities, which were supporting other people that had cancer. She'd been widely praised for this, both for her fight against cancer and for the money that she'd raised, and she won several high-profile awards in the process. However, as it turns out, despite all her success and despite being linked with some very big names, it turns out Belle didn't have cancer. She wasn't given any of the money that she raised to charity, and actually it was just all a big lie. She was a young girl with a health blog, a keyboard, and a really powerful imagination. So as we've touched on today already, nutrition and wellness is a booming industry, but one with a critical problem at its core, and that's that anybody can call themselves a nutritionist or a nutrition guru and dole out advice to the public. This has been kind of a growing issue over the last number of years, where we've seen this big meteoric rise in health bloggers, many of whom have no background in nutrition or science. Because of this, we've had an unprecedented tide of pseudoscience making its way into the public consciousness. And this influences everything from the food on our supermarket shelves and its price, right through to our attitudes and neurosis about food.
Thanks, Helen. So my name's Rosie, this is Helen, and we're both co-founders of the Nutri project, which is a small enterprise we set up about a year ago in response to this overwhelming amount of nutrition information that seems to be bombarding us in the media, the food industry, and the industry that Belle was very much part of, the wellness industry. So we set up this company to give the public what we feel they deserved: simple, easy to understand nutrition information rooted in science based on facts, not fads. And with our science degrees under our belt and years of clinical practice as registered dietitians, we thought we'd try and combine our passion for food, health and science. And one part of what we do is link the public directly with qualified academics and nutrition professionals at our events. And we also try and provide accessible information via infographics that we create and share via social media. We do freelance writing, and we usually do this in response to breaking media stories which have generated confusion or controversy. And our work over this year has led to some really exciting collaborations. And we've also been given the opportunity to speak to people like you. And we want to talk to you today about the importance of credible, evidence-based health messages in the food industry, and how this approach can help both protect the public, improve people's health, and generate trust and authenticity within a brand.
So healthy eating should be easy. But it seems, I'm sure you're all aware, it seems like there's a never-ending stream of confusing and conflicting information that comes through the media. So headlines like the ones you can see behind me on the screen are probably based in science. But in nutrition science in general, it's not really the evidence or the science that matters, it's how we communicate that to the public. Pseudoscience, which is what we're talking about today, it's everywhere. So essentially what pseudoscience is a collection of beliefs or practices which are mistakenly regarded as being grounded in science when they're not. So they can sound legitimate, they can sound sciencey and have a thread of science running through them, but in most cases they're a misrepresentation of good science, or in the worst case they're just blatantly made up. So essentially Rosie and I are dietitians, and ultimately what we're interested in is helping improve people's health by helping them to eat better. And the food industry play a really important role in this, particularly by making the healthy choice the easy choice, but also by making healthy food appealing, accessible, fun, and interesting so that people want to eat it. However,
The people in the food industry and the media also shape our cultural beliefs about food. So as well as having this immense power to be able to do good, they also have the power to potentially cause confusion and in some cases cause harm. And I just wanted to touch on the harm caused by nutritional pseudoscience because sometimes it can feel like a kind of overreaction, but essentially it occurs on a spectrum. And on the low end of that spectrum, we have people maybe wasting money on rubbish products that they don't need and perhaps can't afford. And going up through the spectrum, it's then thinking about how it impacts on people's relationships with food, creating food fears, and certainly we've seen a rise in a condition called orthorexia, which is an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, to the point that it's detrimental to your own health. And then on the high end of the scale, we've got the rare cases where diet and nutrition messages that are based on pseudoscience kind of can turn people away from mainstream medical practices that potentially could save their life in favour of diet and nutrition as a cure-all, which potentially could have been an unwanted side effect of somebody like Belle Gibson's communications, for sure. So, this doesn't just have implications for the public. We're thinking about brands as well today. So as brands and people, we all eat, so we all have views on diet and health. And I think what we're trying to say is that brands need to be more aware of not just pseudoscience, but your own pseudoscientific beliefs. As people become more aware of pseudoscience, brands that are seen to potentially endorse pseudoscience are probably going to lose or unwittingly lose some credibility in the public eye.
So, why do people fall for pseudoscientific beliefs? We thought it might be useful to touch on some of the narratives that pseudoscience plays on us to pull us in so you can see what we're talking about. A really common narrative within pseudoscientific beliefs is one that plays on the way we culturally think about food and also on the guilt that we might feel for living fast-paced, sometimes hedonistic lifestyles that make us feel tired and drained. And how many of us in the audience have maybe had a night out, drunk too much alcohol, eaten too much food, woken up the next day and felt the need to detox? This narrative plays on this and promotes the idea that our environments or lifestyles are toxic and that we need to cleanse ourselves. Usually this involves a specific and quite a lot of the time expensive ritual or product that we need to use, and in some cases a food that we need to eat. And we get sucked in because the message that a food or product will purify us is really appealing. It's a quick fix, quicker than walking more, drinking more, eating more vegetables, drinking more water, and it gives us a simple solution to many of our complex problems. Next, we've got a nod to ancient wisdom. This was touched on by Amelia, and this narrative suggests that if something's old, it must be good. It implies if a piece of knowledge has survived the test of time, it must be true. And it appeals to our wish to hark back to a simpler time. We're bombarded with complex information every day, especially regarding diet and health. And these rules tend to be very simple practices that can easily be applied to our everyday lives, making them really appealing in a sea of mixed messages. A belief that natural is best. This is probably the most common theme you see in products which are sold for their magical properties. Again, it appeals to the simplicity of nature and also the comforting belief that the world provides for us. Saying something is natural sounds really gentle, wholesome, and unprocessed. However, natural is quite an ambiguous term. It isn't a guarantee that it's safe or effective. Cyanide is natural. And the most convincing of the pseudoscientific beliefs have a thread of science running through them. They sound sciencey and complex enough for it to seem like you don't need to check the research out. By this we mean they take something like the alkaline diet, which is based on a misrepresentation of good science and a poor understanding of physiology. You can't meaningfully change the pH of your body and experience beneficial outcomes via eating certain foods. And to top off all of this, nutrition is one of the most difficult sciences to study. This is a big reason why nutrition advice can be so confusing and why researchers and journalists don't seem to agree with each other. First of all, the gold standard studies are very expensive and impractical to run. Also, scientists therefore can't often rely on observational studies. But we can't really prove anything from observational studies. We can only see patterns and links of things that might be connected. Many studies rely on food surveys, so people reporting what they might have eaten 2 or even 10, 20 years ago. Can anyone remember what they ate 10 years ago on a weekly basis? It's extremely difficult and obviously inaccurate. People and food are diverse. If a study on a particular group finds something exciting, it might not actually apply to yourself. And there is conflicts of interest in research.
So how do we know what's evidence-based and what's pseudoscience? This slide behind me now is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it's a really neat way of displaying something that we see happening in the nutrition industry all the time. It shows us how people that have kind of no experience, no science backing, have really high levels of confidence about what they're saying. And perhaps people that are then trained, as they learn a little bit more about what they're doing and they realise that there's complexities and nuance, they lose a little bit of confidence. And what we're seeing is that people that are at the kind of far left of the screen there, that have very little experience, that are super, super confident, are starting to hijack the term evidence-based and science as it becomes trendy and use it for themselves, even though they don't really have any training in scientific method or they don't really know what science means. So, what is evidence? Evidence is a collection of information which helps us decide whether a belief is likely to be true or not. So, say you've got a nutrition question. Obviously, the first thing you do is get out your laptop, get out Google, and you Google it. And then what you're presented with is lots and lots of information, some of which supports and some of which is against your idea of what you believe to be true. And we call this the cherry tree of truth. So, selective cherry picking, as you can see on this tree, might make you think that this is a blue cherry tree. But we need to look at what the whole body of evidence shows, and it's so important in science not to pick singular bits of information and take that as a truth. So we need to look at all the evidence available for and against an idea or belief instead of cherry-picking the evidence that only supports your personal beliefs. And I think, let's face it, we've all been there. This is something we call confirmation bias, and it's something that everybody does. It's in our nature, and it's the tendency we have to search for, interpret, and favour information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So, the other thing we need to be aware of when we're thinking about science and evidence and what evidence is the type of evidence that we're looking at and what that can tell us. So in science, we have different forms of evidence, and they all have different pros and cons and vary in their level of quality. Different types are often arranged in a ranking system or hierarchy that you can see behind me. But it starts at the bottom here. You've got anecdotal evidence, which you probably excuse me. This might be like a nutritional supplement that somebody told you about over a dinner party, that kind of thing. And these things are interesting, but they're kind of not very reliable. Then we've got observational studies, and these are studies where scientists observe groups of people. They can't show us any causative links, but they're really interesting to look at for showing us patterns and things that might be linked together. And then at the top there, we've got randomized controlled trials, which are basically science experiments where we have two groups of people and we'll give one person a diet or a pill and compare them to people that haven't had that pill. And they're studies that can show us cause and effect and are like the gold standard of evidence.
So, food trends can be fun, but the evidence for them doesn't always stack up. Putting turmeric into drinks and tonics is currently really popular in the wellness industry. It's claimed that it promotes healthy brain aging, decreases your risk of chronic diseases like diabetes, perhaps because it's an anti-inflammatory. And it's also popular as an alternative therapy as a treatment for preventing and curing cancer. It's appealing as a remedy because it's natural. There's a nod to ancient wisdom, and also there's a thread of science running through. But what do we know? Well, the part of turmeric thought to be beneficial is a compound called curcumin. However, turmeric only contains tiny amounts of curcumin, maximum 5%, but often as low as 2 to 3%. And additionally, this curcumin is very poorly absorbed by the body. This means you need to eat tons of it to get any beneficial effects, if there are any. And interestingly, studies in test tubes have shown that turmeric has some potential as an anti-inflammatory or anti-cancer agent. However, when we then do clinical trials, so scientific studies, most examining turmeric as an anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer agent have found the small amount of curcumin in regular turmeric isn't well absorbed, and when taken orally, you don't tend to get enough to have a medicinal effect. So maybe curcumin will be used alongside conventional cancer treatment one day. However, at the moment, it's too early to say for sure, and we, as often in nutritional science, we need more studies. So what's the bottom line? Based on the progressing science, the claims about turmeric may seem harmless, and in some cases it is. Eating turmeric in curries, drinking it in tonics, or having a latte with it in isn't likely to have any negative effects on your health and may even be beneficial, who knows. But the way this is communicated is really important. When benefits are sold as absolutes, for example, turmeric is anti-cancer, especially when there's uncertainty, this is where we can cause harm. And this narrative could lead people to ditch chemo in favour of alternative therapies, or lead to disastrous extrapolations of science, which might sound melodramatic, but has sadly happened to at least one woman who died in the US, where she had an intravenous infusion of turmeric by her naturopathic doctor. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe. Just because there's a thread of science running through doesn't mean it's a cure or miracle. But on the plus side, the tide is turning in this post-truth era. And in line with this, people are starting to catch on to nutrition nonsense in a similar way that they are becoming wise to photoshopped images and unrealistic body standards. And even though there's a long way to go, we're starting to see less tolerance for nutritional pseudoscience. And with science-based messaging becoming trendy, producing health-based messages on evidence is key. Online, people highly value authenticity, and unethical marketing practices are an old hat. Companies which embrace an evidence-based approach will be seen as more authentic and therefore more favourably and have an edge. An example of the hunger for more science-based messages in nutrition can be seen through the success of Anthony Warner's recent book. Anthony, aka The Angry Chef, is a chef with a science background who sees himself as a science attack dog. He exposes lies in the nutrition industry and has a very sweary, humorous blog that's now been made into a book. His popularity is testament to people wanting to learn about the scientific method and the benefits of explaining the whys and the uncertainty about nutrition to the public. And the public are catching on, as evidenced by the clean eating backlash. The biggest food trend to sweep the UK recently was clean eating, which has received swaths of bad press recently, in part due to its ambiguous name, which means different things to different people and has close links with disordered eating patterns like orthorexia nervosa. Clean eating is another example of our obsession for purity. The movement received criticism initially because its name imparts a moral value to food, that eating food deemed clean makes you pure and good, and if you don't, then you're dirty and impure. And we don't have time to go into all of this today, but the complexities of language and food is an important thing to consider. Guilt-free is a popular term, which implies eating some foods is naughty. And additionally, real food is making a splash in place of clean eating, despite having similar problems as its predecessor.
So we wanted to talk to you as well about how to ensure your messages are evidence-based, and we're quite short on time now, so I'm just going to fly through these quite quickly. Our first tip is to make sure that you're working with qualified, credible experts. Udos chose not to do this recently, and they claimed on their advertising powder that a greens powder had 2 portions of somebody's fruit and vegetables a day, which is unfortunately not true, and powdered supplements can't count towards our fruit and vegetable intake because they're too far removed from the original topic. Our next one is to embrace engaging publicly. Deliciously, Ella recently did this. She was obviously at the centre of the clean eating movement, and she faced her criticism head on and came out of this quite well. So don't be afraid to correct mistakes, learn from them, because people do respect authenticity and transparency. Our next one is to make sure that your off-packaging language counts too. So obviously, health claims on packaging are very strictly regulated, but people can be tempted to stray away from this on websites and blogs and Instagram particularly. There's a brand here that we've got online that claims to be credible and science-based, but the language they use in their Instagram posts, like detoxification and hormone balancing, makes them seem untrustworthy because this is a contradiction. Our next one is to use science and not anecdotes or pseudoscience, which ties into what we were talking about before, but make sure your interpretation of science is correct. I think we'll go through to the next one. And then our next one is also being careful about, obviously, getting influencers and social media personalities to share products is a trend for good reason, but be careful about how they're sharing these messages as well. This particular example is a reality TV star who was sharing a post to her very young Instagram audience about carb blockers. And carb blockers contain a substance called white kidney bean extract, which stop you absorbing starch as easily. And so this post particularly had a huge backlash for a number of reasons, mostly because it was irresponsible because she's sort of promoting this kind of disordered eating of you can eat all these carbohydrates and you won't absorb them because then you can have these carb blockers. But there's also the other side of that, which is if you do eat carb blockers and that amount of carbohydrate, you're going to get what we would say is some unwanted gastrointestinal side effects, which weren't talked about either. So,
we'll just whiz through these quickly.
Yep. So the last few are to assess the evidence before reacting to the headlines, and there's a number of places you can do that. NHS Behind the Headlines is one. The Science Media Centre are fantastic. They have some experts that give you a snapshot of what the whole science says. And then we've got Ask for Evidence, which isn't nutrition focused, but is a charity that was set up to pick through spurious media claims. And you can ask them direct questions on their website. And the final one is just being cautious when you're communicating messages of these red flags on the board here. A lot of these are sort of synonymous with pseudoscience and pseudoscientific messages.
So very briefly, who's got it right? We could have mentioned quite a few people, but we're short for time. One brand we've worked with recently is Leon. They've jumped on a trend, gut health, but they hired an evidence-based specialist to help them out with the science. So Dr. Megan Rosie is a gut health researcher at King's College London. She's a registered dietitian, so she's got the brains, the qualifications, but she's also media-facing. So it really was the perfect evidence-based partnership to launch their gut health menu. And this isn't really a food trend as such, but this is a newly launched magazine for teenagers, which we love. They collaborate with evidence-based practitioners to make sure that their messages are grounded in science, but also accessible. And if you're interested in evidence-based nutrition, these are some fantastic, vocal, evidence-based professionals you can follow on Twitter. We'll tweet this slide for you later on, and I know you're going to get access to the slides at some point in the future as well. And so just remember that you may believe in unicorns, but if you're selling unicorn water, we've got a responsibility to ensure that the evidence stacks up, and people will be asking. Here's our contact details, and thank you very much, Charles, for having us to speak today.